Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding a Mishnah Berurah Chela Gimel, and Mirz Hashem today we will be learning Daf Kuf Lamed Aleph Amid Aleph. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Shabbos, and today we will be beginning a brand new Siman, Siman Shin Yud Zayin, Din Keshira Va'aniva B'Shabbos, the halachos that pertain to tying knots, making various types of loops on Shabbos, Uboy Zayin Seifim, and here we have 7 seifim. Our learning should be a schos for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael Hanusuna Batzara Bashivya Ha'im De Bein Bayam Ubein Bayavasha Hamakim Yirachim Alehem V'Yetziam Yitzar L'Rvacha Me'afelu L'Oiro Mishibud L'Geula Hashta Bagala V'Zman Kariv V'Nemar Amen. Our learning should be a schos Refuah Shalema from Shemer ben Esther Fradel Yitzchak ben Sion ben Dusha Rivka Bas Shira Leah Chavadasa Bas Serel Avram ben Sion ben Sarah Liba. They should have a Refuah Shalema B'Sar Shar Chayil Yisrael. Our learning should be a schus for Yonison ben Michal and Yoel ben Michal. The Rebbe Shalom should watch over them together with all of our other brothers and sisters who find themselves in harm's way. Now, before I turn to Siman Shin Yud Zayin, I want to just point out a couple of very basic halachos lamaisa when it comes to the previous Siman Shin Tez Zayin, where we learned the halachos of tzeda, just because these are things that tend to be very, very degel lamaisa, and very often I find that people are not sure precisely what the halacha is. So, we learned about trapping different types of animals and different types of insects. Very often the question comes up, what happens when there's a bee buzzing around, a bee, a hornet, a wasp, some kind of a stinging or biting insect that inflicts considerable pain, something that makes a serious bite. Are you allowed to trap such an animal? So the halacha would be, it would be mutter to go ahead and trap such an insect. Again, we're talking about something that inflicts a considerable amount of pain. You are allowed to trap such an insect. Now, why is it that you're allowed to trap such an insect? So the answer, and we saw this in the Mishnah Berurah, this would be found in Mishnah Berurah Ois Cotton Chav Zayin, which begins on the bottom of Kuf Chav Zayin Amud Aleph and continues on to Kuf Chav Zayin Amud Beis, where the Mishnah Berurah explains that when you trap such a, it's based on the Mechaber. The Mechaber over here says, Hatzod Nechoshim B'Shabbos, if somebody traps a snake on Shabbos, Oy Sha'ar Remosim Hamazikim, or other types of insects that are mazikim, that they inflict a considerable amount of harm. And the Mechaber said it depends why you're trapping it. Imla refuah, if you're trapping it because you want the insect for the preparation, you need the venom or some part of the insect for some kind of medicinal preparation, then chayiv. Why? Because in that case, the tzeda would be a malacha shetzricha legufa. You're doing the act of trapping for the intended purpose of the malacha of tzeda. You're doing it to trap the insect, to have and keep and use the insect. That would be an issa daraisa. We can't be mater an issa daraisa. Ve'im b'shvil shelo yishchenu. However, the Mechaber said, if the reason you're trapping the insect or the animal is so that it should not be able to bite, then mutter. And the Mishnah Berurah in the Ois Katan Chav Zayin explains, the reason is because now the tzeda is a malacha she'ein tzricha legufa. You're not doing the trapping for the intended purpose of trapping. You're trapping the animal essentially to get rid of it. You're not trapping it because you want it. You're trapping it to prevent it from biting. If you could prevent it from biting in some other way other than trapping it, you'd be very happy. So you're not trapping it because you want to trap it. So this is a malacha she'ein tzricha legufa. And then, as the Mishnah Berurah says, v'haka mishum hezeka, and in a case where it's going to really do harm, it's going to inflict considerable pain, afilu issa d'Rabbanan leka, there's no issa d'Rabbanan, it would be mutter. Now, the catch is, if you take a look at the Sharitzir and Ois Cotton Lamed Tes, back over there on Chav Zayin Amud Beis, you'll see that the Mishnah Berurah is machriya, at least it seems that the Mishnah Berurah is being machriya, that yes, you could trap it, but you should not trap it using any kind of a specialized trap. So you shouldn't trap it most of the bee traps that we have nowadays are not things that you use to go and trap an animal. They're things that you hang and you allow them to passively trap animals. But if you had some kind of a trap that you're going to use specifically, it's made to trap an insect or trap something like that the Mishnah Berurah says you should stay away from. You should trap it by taking a cup or taking a bowl or something like that and overturning it on top of the insect. Why is that? The Mishnah Berurah says you don't want it to look like you're actually going ahead and doing tzeda for the purpose of tzeda. You don't want it to look like you're doing a halacha shetzricha legufa. And if you're using a trap, a specially constructed trap, then it looks like you're doing tzeda mamish, a halacha shetzricha legufa. Now, what would be if we're not talking about a bee or a hornet or a wasp or something like that? Let's say we're dealing with something like a mosquito, right? A mosquito is not, for most people, a mosquito does not inflict a considerable amount of pain. So generally speaking, when it comes to something like a mosquito, the halacha would be that it depends. If the mosquito is actually on your body, then really the best thing to do is to try to shake it off, blow it off. If you have to, knock it off, but do something to avoid trapping it. If the only way you can get rid of it is by taking it, so now when you take it in your fingers, you're actually trapping it, right? If the only way you can get rid of it is by trapping it and throwing it away, you could take it, trap it, and throw it away. But we're not going to be matir tzeda d'Rabbanan in this case, because usually the hezek of a mosquito is a very minor hezek. Now, I mentioned this when we said shir on this halacha. There are people who react very strongly to mosquito bites. I have some in my own family. For them, a mosquito bite is just as bad as a bee sting. In that case, the halacha would be the same as a bee. Also, you have to know what the halacha is if you live in an area where the diseases that are carried by mosquitoes are unfortunately somewhat prevalent. Then it could also be that the mosquito would be treated like a bee. Now, if the mosquito is not on your person, then you have no heter to trap it whatsoever, again, in the vast majority of cases. Okay, I just wanted, just one other thing I'll mention when it comes to these halachos of tzeda, people who have pets. Most specifically, I'm going to mention right now something like a pet dog. As a pet dog is something that walks around the house. Do you have an issue of tzeda if you go ahead and you close the door on the house, that you're trapping the dog inside the house? Most often the answer will be no, because that's what we referred to when we learned these halachas as a fully domesticated animal. If you remember, we spoke about a para, a sus, farm animals, animals that are completely domesticated. These are animals to which the Isser of Tzeda does not apply at all, because these animals are always considered nitzaid va'omed. A pet dog, a pet puppy, is considered nitzaid va'omed. It's not running away from you. It's not something that you have to go and trap, and therefore there would be no Isser of, so to speak, trapping it in the house. A cat could present a bigger problem. We closed out the Siman Shin Tev Zayin with the Ramah that said chosel dina kishar chaya, that a chosel is like a chaya. There are halachas of tzeda when it comes to a cat, because a cat, generally speaking, I don't know the nature of pet cats, how fully domesticated they become. The only experience I ever had with a pet cat was when I was newly married and I lived in a rental apartment, and I had an Eino Yehudi neighbor who had a pet cat, and he went away on vacation, and he asked me to do him a favor and take care of his cat while he was away for a couple of days. Now, it's interesting in the context of these halachas. What did he want me to do? He wanted me to come into the apartment at night and open the door and let the cat out. And the cat would go roam. And then go and open the door in the morning. The cat would be waiting on the stoop, let the cat back in, open up a can of cat food, put down a can of cat food, and let him and leave him alone. And he would eat his cat food. But there you see that the cat, even though this was a pet cat, this is not an animal that is fully domesticated, that is nitzaid va'omed. This particular cat was nocturnal. It liked to roam at night. It wanted to roam free at night, and it came back during the day. So it's a semi-domesticated animal, not a fully domesticated animal, and the halachas of tzeda would apply. Okay, now that we've covered that, let's move along to Siman Shin Yud Zayin, Kuf Lamed Aleph Amud Aleph, Din Keshira Va'aniva B'Shabbos Uboy Zayin Seifim. So we're going to start this very interesting siman, and again, this is a siman that's going to have a lot of halacha lamaisa ramifications. We're going to begin not with the Mechaber, we're going to begin with the Mishnah Berurah, where the Mishnah Berurah gives a very beautiful hakdama that's going to lay the groundwork for this siman. Once we see this Mishnah Berurah, the hakdama of the Mishnah Berurah here, at least the beginning of the siman should flow very easily. Says the Mishnah Berurah, B'Gemara Amrinan, the Gemara in Kuf Yud Beis Amud Aleph in Masechta Shabbos tells us, the Yesh Kan Shalosh Chalukos. There are 3 different categories when it comes to knots on Shabbos. Now let's remember, kosher, tying a knot, is one of the lamites malachos. Now, the Mishnah Berurah tells us that you see in the Gemara that the Gemara categorizes knots into 3 different categories. Echad, chayiv chatos. There's one category of knot where if you tie such a knot, it would be an issur daraisa, so that if you did it b'shoigeg, you would be chayiv to bring a carbon chatos. The echad. Then there's another category of knots where it's pater aval aser, where it's an issur darabanan. Should you tie such a knot b'shoigeg on Shabbos, you would be pater from bringing a carbon chatos aval aser. But this still is aser midrabanan. The echad, and then there's a third category of knots that are mutter lechatchila. So you have one category of knot where to tie such a knot is an issur daraisa. You have another category of knot where to tie such a knot is an issur darabanan. And then there's a third category of knot where to tie such a knot is mamish mutter lechatchila. It's not aser, not midaraisa, not even midrabanan. Now it's still a knot. You still are tying a knot. But somehow this is a knot which is mutter lechatchila. Now the Mishnah Berurah is going to run us through a major machlokes rishonim, how we are to understand these 3 different categories. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ulashitas harif v'harambam, it's the opinion of the Rif and the Rambam, v'hamechaber desasam kivasayu, and this we're going to see is the opinion of the Mechaber. So the Mechaber is going to follow the shita of the Rif and the Rambam, dina hachi. According to them, the halacha is as follows. De'im hu kesher shel kayama, if the knot that you're tying is a permanent knot. Now, what does permanent knot mean? Says the Mishnah Berurah, kigoyin, for example, shedarkoi sheyiyeh kach lo'olam. This is a type of knot where once you tie it, you usually intend this knot to remain tied lo'olam, forever. This is a knot that you tie once, and generally speaking, you never take this knot out. That's what we're calling a kesher shakayama here. So according to the Rif and the Rambam, im hu kesher shakayama, if you're tying a real bona fide permanent knot, kigoyin, for example, shedarkoi sheyiyeh kach la'olam. For example, a knot that's intended to remain in place forever. Dahainu, and now the Mishnah Berurah qualifies this a little bit. She'enoi kaitziv zman b'daitoi lahatira. You have no, in your mind, you don't have any time that you intend on untying this knot. You tied this knot, and again, it's a knot that generally is intended to remain in place forever. And when you tied it, you didn't have any thought in your mind, oh, I'm going to untie it at a certain point. No. It's a knot, again, that's intended to remain in place. And it's also, not only is it a kesher shel kayama, but it's a kesher that's a maisei uman. It's a professional knot. It's not a kesher hedyet. It's not a simple knot that common people tie. No, this is a professional knot. Chayiv chatos. So according to the Rif and the Rambam, the first category of knot, that if you tied such a knot, it would be an issur daraisa. There are 2 variables. There are two check boxes that you need to check off in order for the tying of that knot to be an issa daraisa. One, it has to be a kesher shel kayama. It has to be a real permanent knot that was intended to remain in place. Variable number two, it has to be something which is a maaseh uman. It needs to be a professional knot or a craftsman's knot. V'nisbar l'kamon b'soif hasif b'haga, and we're going to see at the end of Sif Aleph, in the words of the Ramah, mam hu maaseh uman. Exactly what type of knot is considered to be a maaseh uman, a professional knot. Okay, so that, again, category number one, according to the Rif and the Rambam, it's a kesher shel kayama, and it's a maaseh uman. That's an issa daraisa. Now we're going to move along to category number two, according to the Rif and the Rambam. What constitutes an issa darabana? V'emu kesher shel kayama ve'enoi maaseh uman. What if you could only tick off one of the boxes? Let's say it's a permanent knot. It's darkoi liyas kach la'olam. It was intended to remain in place, but it's not a professional knot. It's not a maaseh uman. Or maaseh uman, you tick off the other box. It is a professional knot. Ve'ena kesher shel kayama. But it's not a bona fide kesher shel kayama. It's not a knot that was intended to just remain in place forever. Then, pater avalasa. That, according to the Rif and the Rambam, would constitute an issa darabana. Einoi maaseh uman ve'einoi kesher shel kayama. But if you don't tick off either one of the boxes, the knot that you're tying is not a permanent knot, and it's not a maaseh uman, it's not a professional knot, mutar lechatchila. According to the Rif and the Rambam, tying such a knot would be mutar lechatchila. It's not asur b'drabanan, it's not asur b'daraisa. So again, just to recap the shita of the Rif and the Rambam, you have three categories. Essentially, there are two variables that we're dealing with. If you tie a knot that's a kesher shel kayama and a maaseh uman, it's a daraisa. If it's only one of them, it's a kesher shel kayama, not a maaseh uman, or it's a maaseh uman but not a kesher shel kayama, it's a darabana. If you cannot tick off either one of the boxes, it's not a kesher shel kayama and it's not a maaseh uman, that's mutar lechatchila. Vedas Rashi v'Harash u'shar poskim. Then you have the opinion of primarily Rashi and the Rosh and other poskim. Delay tali klal be'etzem hakesher imhu maaseh uman. According to Rashi and the Rosh, the question of whether or not the knot that you're tying is a professional knot, that doesn't enter the equation of whether or not this becomes an issa daraisa, issa darabanan, mutar lechatchila. Ella, rather, according to Rashi and the Rosh, ikar hachilik hu. The main question over here in determining the three categories of knots is di'im hu kesher shel kayama. If the knot that you're tying is a bona fide kesher shel kayama, dahainu shedarkei shishar kach la'olam v'chanal, meaning a knot that typically would be left in place forever, chayiv chatas. That is an issa daraisa. Va'afilu imu maaseh hedyet. According to Rashi and the Rosh, it doesn't matter the nature of the knot, whether this type of knot is considered a professional knot, a maaseh uman, or a maaseh hedyet. That's not negeya. The question is the quality of the knot, meaning is it a real kesher shel kayama or not? If it's a real kesher shel kayama, if it's a real permanent knot, darkei liyos kach la'olam, then according to Rashi and the Rosh, that's an issa daraisa, whether it's a maaseh uman or not. V'im ein darkei l'koishrei rak l'zman. But if it's a knot that's not a bona fide kesher shel kayama, it's not darkei liyos kach la'olam, but it's a knot that is tied to remain in place for a significant amount of time. Now, what constitutes a significant amount of time? That we'll see later in this year. But right now, 30,000 feet, according to Rashi and the Rosh, a bona fide kesher shel kayama, a real permanent knot, is a daraisa. If it's not a real permanent knot, but it is intended to remain place lizman, for a significant amount of time, then pater avalasa. That's not an issa daraisa, because it's not a real kesher shel kayama. But it is an issa darabanan. And the Mishnah Berurah says, why? the domi ktsas l'shel kayama, because it is somewhat similar to the real bona fide kesher shel kayama. It's not a real kesher shel kayama, but it is intended to remain in place for a significant amount of time. That's an issa d'Rabbanan. And again, va'afilu him u'maisa hedyet. Again, whether it's a professional knot, a maisa uman or a maisa hedyet, that doesn't enter into the equation. Not negeya. V'im darka lahatiroi ba'oisa yoim. But if it's a real temporary knot, it's a knot that you're going to untie on the same day. You're going to tie it Shabbos morning, you're going to untie it Shabbos afternoon. That, according to Rashi, the Rosh, mutar l'chatchila. It's mamish mutar l'chatchila. And it's mutar l'chatchila, afilu hu ma'aseh uman. Even if it's a professional knot, doesn't matter. The ain shame kesher alav, because it's not considered a knot. Why? Because it has no permanence. The Yeshayim, and we'll see that when it comes to this question of what is a knot that's mutar l'chatchila, Yeshayim dechami shadarka lahater b'say shiva yamim, heavy k'may shadarka lahater b'say yamim. There's a more kulidik opinion that holds that even if you're going to leave the knot tied for more than a day, you're going to leave it for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 days, it's still considered a temporary knot, and according to Rashi in the Rosh, it would be mutar l'chatchila. The bar, according to this opinion, is 7 days. A knot that's intended to remain in place for 7 days or more, but it's not a real kesher shel kayama, you're going to untie it after 10 days, that, this shita holds, is only an issa d'Rabbanan. So again, what do we have here? We have the shita of Rashi and the Rosh. The shita of Rashi and the Rosh, they don't take into consideration the question of whether the knot is a maaseh umad, a professional knot, or a maaseh hedyet, a simple common person's knot. Not that they hold is not negeya to the shaila. The whole shaila of how to categorize these knots and to decide whether tying such a knot is an issa d'Rabbanan, or mutar l'chatchila, is only a question of the permanence of the knot. If the knot is a true kesher shel kayama, darka eliyas kach la'olam, it's an issa d'oraisa. If it's a knot that's being tied for ktsas zman, if it's being tied for a significant amount of time, it's an issa d'Rabbanan. If it's a knot that's being tied, but it's not going to be left in place for a significant amount of time, then it's mamish mutar l'chatchila. What constitutes a significant amount of time? You have one shita that says if it's intended to remain in place for more than a day, it's an issa d'Rabbanan. You have another shita that says no. More than a day is okay. More than 7 days is going to be an issa d'Rabbanan. Okay, so that's the beautiful Akdama of the Chavetz Chaim here. And against that backdrop, let's begin the Siman. Let's begin Sif Aleph. Now, let's remember right away from the get-go that the Chavetz Chaim told us that the Mechaber paskins like the Rif and the Rambam. And we'll see that right away over here. Says the Mechaber. Ha-koisher kesher shel kayama. If somebody ties a permanent knot, v'hu maaseh uman. And not only is it a permanent knot, it's also a professional knot. Chayiv, that's an issa d'oraisa. Says the Mishnah Berurah's Katan Aleph, kesher shel kayama, va'afilu lo mihadik shapir. Even if you tied this kesher shel kayama, which is also a maaseh uman, it's a professional knot, but you did not tie it tightly. So that's afilu lo mihadik shapir. Even if you didn't tie it very tightly, v'yuchal la'atiroi ba'achas miyadav, so that you would be able to open this knot with one hand. So this is not a knot that you're going to have to get into and use both your hands and your fingertips to go untie it. No, you could open it up with one hand. But it's a kesher shel kayama, it's intended to remain in place forever, and it's a maaseh uman, it's a professional knot. That, says the Mishnah Berurah, chayiv. That's what the Mechaber is calling it, it's a d'oraisa. Kevan de lo yeh nitar me'atzmai. As long as it's not going to come out on its own. A knot that's going to open up on its own, that's already not a kesher. But if it's a kesher shel kayama, it's intended to remain in place forever. It's a maaseh uman. It's a professional knot. And it'll stay closed, even though you could open it with one hand, that would be an issa d'oraisa. Now let's go back to the Mechaber, where the Mechaber is going to give us several examples of what would constitute an Issa Daraisa, according to the Rif and the Rambam, and that's who the Mechaber is poskening like. Says the Mechaber, Kigoin, for example, Kesher Hagamolim, the knot that was tied by camel drivers. The Kesher Hasaponim, and the knots that are used on ships. The Kishrei Ritzuais and Ritzuais Minol, and the knots on the straps of shoes, the sandal or sandals, Shekoshrim Haratzonim, that the shoemakers tie, Bishas Asiyasan, when they make the shoes, the Chen Kol Kayotza Bazeh, or any other knot that is similar to these knots. Now, what are these knots? Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah's cut base, Kesher Hagamolim, the knot that was tied by camel drivers. Now the Mishnah Berurah is going to explain exactly which knot we're talking about, and that's going to give us a window into what the Rif and the Rambam and the Mechaber call a Kesher Shakayama. Says the Mishnah Berurah, what is this Kesher Hagamolim? Shenoikvin Lagamal Bechotmai. They would pierce the nose of the camel. So you have the septum inside the nose of the camel. They would pierce the septum, and then what would they do? V'noisted by tabas shel ritzua. They would take a leather strap and put it through the piercing inside the nose of the camel, and they would form a ring out of this leather strap. Now, you take a leather strap and you push it through the piercing inside the nose. Right now, the leather strap is not yet formed into a ring. It's an open strap. What do you do now? V'koishrinoisa. Now you're going to take the two loose ends of this leather strap and you're going to tie them together. V'aimedes sham la'olam. Now that leather loop that is now closed, tied closed, is intended to remain in the nose of the camel forever. And what's its purpose? When you want to tie the camel up, what do? So that leather strap that you're forming, you're tying it into a ring, and it's inside the nose of the camel. That's intended to remain in the nose of the camel. It's intended to remain tied close and stay in the nose of the camel forever. You use it so that when you want to tie up the camel, now you take a long leather strap and you tie it to that loop. The kaishrinba, and you use that to tie up the camel. Upa'amim shematira. Now there are times that you want to take that long leather strap off. So when you want to take that long leather strap off, you untie it from the leather loop that you tied into the nose. But the leather loop itself, that you never untie. That is something that the camel driver does once. He pierces the nose of the camel, he puts in that leather strap, he ties the loop closed, and he makes it into a ring. That is intended to remain closed forever. So that knot is a bona fide kesher shakayama. V'aisa kesher harishain, that first knot, the knot on that loop, who kesher hagamolim, that is a professional knot that is made by camel drivers. They had a certain way that they would tie it. Shuhu kesher shakayama, and it's also a permanent knot. It is darko liyos kach la'olam. It's intended to remain forever. So that was the first example that the Mechaber gave us of an Iser Daraisa, Lishitas Harif Harambam, and the Mechaber. It's darko liyos kach la'olam, so it's a bona fide kesher shakayama, and it's a maaseh uman. It's something that the gamolim, it's a knot that the gamolim used. The second example, Ois Kat Gimel, the Kesher Asaponim, the sailor's knot, the knots on ships. Gam Hu Kimin Tabas, Sha'oisin Min Ritzua. This is another knot that was made in a leather strap. Banekev Shibaroish Hasfina. This is, they would have a steel eye on the front of the ship. So you have a steel ring on the front of the ship. And they would take now a leather strap and they would tie it onto that ring, and they would make a leather ring. Va'oisa kesher miskayim tamid. And that, or it sounds like it's not even an iron ring on the front of the ship. They would make a hole on the front of the ship, and they would take a leather strap, the same way the Gamolim do in the nose of the camel. The sailors would do this to a hole that was drilled in the ship. They would take a leather strap, push it through the hole, and then tie it closed into a ring. V'oisa kesher b'skayim tamid. And that leather strap is supposed to remain tied closed forever. Ukisharoitza laha amida, when you want to park the ship, when you want to tie the ship down, kosher ritzua, I guess, moor. When you want to moor the ship, kosher ritzua ba'isa tabas, you then take a long rope or a long leather strap and you tie it onto that closed leather ring, umamidan ba, and that's how you moor the ship. Ukisharoitza la atira, and then when you want to let the ship loose, matir haritzua v'naitla. So now you take the long rope or the long strap and you untie it from the closed loop. But again, oisa kesher arishon shel tabas, but that leather ring that you tied closed in the hole on the ship, hu kesher asaponim. That's a professional sailor's knot, which is darkei liyos kach la'olam. It's supposed to remain tied forever. So it's a kesher shakayama, it's a maisi uman, it would be an issa daraisa. The next example that the Mechaber gave was the shoemaker's knot. I'm pausing over here because I'm trying to remember the cobbler. I was trying to remember the English name, the proper English name for a shoemaker, the cobbler. So the Mechaber told us the knot in the strap of a shoe or a sandal that the cobbler would tie when he was making the shoe. Explains the Mishnah Berurah, this was the knot that was tied on the strap that went into the shoe, so that the strap should not be able to be removed. And again, this is something that was intended to remain in place forever. Now, this is a knot that we actually described a little while ago. It's escaping me right now which halacha it was negea to, but we described the shoe. Oh, it was bameh ish yoitza. We were talking about the different articles of clothing that you can go out wearing on Shabbos. So we were describing shoes. They used to have a shoe, which basically you had a simple platform. That was the sole of the shoe. That was the bottom of the shoe. It had several holes in it. You would take a leather strap, push it down through the hole, and then you tied a knot in that strap so that the strap cannot pull out of the platform. So that's the way they would fasten leather straps that went over the top of the foot. So you needed to tie a knot to prevent the strap from being able to pull back out through the hole. That was, again, a maaseh uman. It's a cobbler's knot, and it's a kesher shakayama, because you tie that knot once, and it's intended to remain in place forever, until as long as the shoe lasts. So it's a kesher shakayama and a maaseh uman, and that would be an iser daraisa. Okay, now let's go weiter in the Mechaber. We're 3 lines down, the second word into the line. So far the Mechaber told us over here, rule number 1, you tie a kesher shakayama and it's a maaseh uman. That's category number 1, Shita HaMechaber, which is the Shita of the Rif and the Rambam. This is an Issa Daraisa. You checked off both boxes. It's a Kesher Shakayama and it's a Maaseh Uman. Aval, however, says the Mechaber, HaKosher Kesher Shakayama ve'enoi Maaseh Uman. But what if it's a permanent knot, but it's not a professional knot? It's not a Maaseh Uman. Then the Shita HaMechaber is Potter. If you did this b'shegeg, you would be potter from bringing a carbon chatas. But we know the golden rule in Hilchos Shabbos, potter means potter aval aser, but it is aser b'derabanan. Okay, so now we have over here category number 2, and this is the first part of category number 2, according to the Mechaber, right? Category number 2, according to the Rif and the Rambam, which is Shitas HaMechaber, is if you only tick off one of the boxes. So it's a Kesher Shakayama, it's a permanent knot, but it's not a Maaseh Uman, it's not a professional knot. That's going to be the Sidrabanan. In tomorrow's shir, we'll see that if you tick off the other box and not the first box, it's also an Issa D'Rabbanan. So if it's going to be a Maisi Uman but not a Kesher Shakayama, that's also going to be an Issa D'Rabbanan. That's going to be in tomorrow's shir. Right now we have in the Mechaber part number 1 of the Issa D'Rabbanan, which is it's a Kesher Shakayama, but it's not a Maisi Uman. That is an Issa D'Rabbanan. Now we see the Ramah. Says the Ramah. However, v'yesh cholkim, there are those shittas that disagree, and this is going to be Rashi and the Rosh. Now let's follow the paper trail carefully over here. Why is the Mechaber interjecting right now? Because the Mechaber just told us that in order for a knot to be an Issa Daraisa, you need to tick off both of these boxes. You need it to be a Kesher Shakayama, and you need it to be a Maisa Uman. But remember what we saw in the Chavetz Chaim's beautiful Akdama. Rashi and the Rosh hold that the question of whether a knot is a Maisa Uman, a professional knot, or a Maisa Hedyet, according to them, that doesn't enter into the equation. The only question of whether a knot is going to be an Issa D'Rabbanan, an Issa D'Oraisa, or Mutar L'Chatchila is the permanence of the knot. How permanent is it? So that's why the Ramah is jumping in right now. The Mechaber just hitched his wagon very, very clearly to the Rif and the Rambam. You need, in order for something to be an Issa D'Oraisa, you need it to be a Maisa Uman. But if it's a Kesher Shakayama and it's not a Maisa Uman, it's only an Issa D'Rabbanan. Jumps in the Ramah with the sheet of Rashi and the Rosh. Hagah says the Ramah v'yesh cholkim, there are those who disagree with this sheet of the Mechabers, which is the sheet of the Rif and the Rambam. Shesvir lahu, these sheetas, Rashi and the Rosh, they hold the chol Kesher Shel Kayama, any knot that is a real bona fide Kesher Shel Kayama, this means the real permanent knot, darkly is kach lo'olam, afilu shel hedyet, even if it's not a Maisi Uman, it's not only a Maisi Hedyet, chayav and olav. You're chayiv, it's an Issa D'Oraisa anyway. Since it's a bona fide Kesher Shel Kayama, it's an Issa D'Oraisa, even though it's only a Maisi Hedyet. Let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Hey. The chol Kesher Shel Kayama, hainu she'ein darkei lahatiroi la'olam. There are those that say that any real bona fide permanent knot, a knot that you're never intending on opening, is going to be an Issa D'Oraisa. Now, the Mishnah Berurah is going to point out now that when it comes to Rashi and the Rosh, and we saw this in the Mishnah Berurah's Hakdama, that's not the only machlokes between Rashi and the Rosh and the Rif and the Rambam, right? Point of contention number 1 between Rashi and the Rosh, between Rashi, the Rosh, and the Rif and the Rambam, is according to the Rif and the Rambam, you could only have an Issa D'Oraisa if it's a Kesher Shel Kayama and it's a Maisa Uman. According to Rashi and the Rosh, you could have an Issa D'Oraisa if it's a Kesher Shel Kayama, even if it's only a Maisa Hedyet. But that's not the only point of contention between them. Let's go further in the Mishnah Berurah, even though really we're going to have to see the Ramah, but I think it's going to be easier to understand the Ramah as the Ramah is written after we see the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, continuing in Ois Katan Hey, V'deyazu, this shita that the Ramah is bringing down, the shita of Rashi and the Rosh, Pliga HaMechaber, argues on the shita of the Mechaber, Gam b'she'enoi shel kayama v'hu Maisa Hedyet, also by a knot that's not a real Kesher Shel Kayama, and it's only a Maisa Hedyet. V'hayadaitoi she'iskayim ha'kesher ezizman, but it's a knot that's intended to remain in place for a significant amount of time. Delaha Mechaber, mutter. According to the Mechaber, such a knot would be mutter legamri, right? Let's do the math. According to the Mechaber, if you have a kesher that's not a real Kesher Shel Kayama, it's not darkei liyas kach la'olam, so it's not a Kesher Shel Kayama, and it's not a Maisa Uman, right? It's a Maisa Hedyet. According to the Mechaber, that's the knot that's mutar l'chatchila. It's mutar legamri. You're allowed to tie such a knot. Remember, according to Rif and the Rambam, what are the 3 categories? Category number 1 is a D'Oraisa, is a kesher shakayama and a maaseh uman, right? Category number 2, Issa Darabanan, is either it's a kesher shakayama and a maaseh hedyet, or it's a maaseh, or it's a kesher shakayama, right, and it's not a maaseh uman, or it's a maaseh uman and it's not a kesher shakayama, but it has one of the key variables. That's an Issa Darabanan. But if it's not a kesher shakayama, if it's not a real permanent knot, darker liyas kach la'olam, and it's a maaseh hedyet, it's not a professional knot, that's mutar legamri according to the Rif and the Rambam. So if you have a knot that's intended to remain in place for 10 days, according to the Mechaber, and it's not a professional knot, what would the halacha be? Mutar legamri. It's 100% mutar, because it's not a real kesher shakayama, and it's not a maaseh uman. So according to the Mechaber, that knot is mutar legamri. Uladei azuk, says the Mishnah Berurah, but according to the shita of Rashi and the Rosh that's being brought down by the Ramah, Potter Aval, such a knot is an Issa Darabanan. Because remember what we saw in the Chavetz Chaim's Hakdama, Shitas Rashi and the Rosh. If you have a knot that's not a real Kesher Shal Kayama, but it's intended to remain in place for a significant amount of time, that's your Issa Darabanan, according to Rashi and the Rosh. And again, maaseh uman, maaseh hedyet, not negeya, according to Rashi and the Rosh. According to Rashi and the Rosh, Issa Daraisa, a bona fide kesher shakayama, darker liyas kach la'olam. Issa Darabanan, it's not a real bona fide kesher shakayama, but it is a knot that was tied lizman, for a significant amount of time. That's an Issa Darabanan. That's this case. Uladei zu pater aval aser, the damik tzas l'kesher shakayama. And that is what the Ramah is about to say right now, where the Ramah is going to bring down 2 yesh omrims. The Ladeya Harishona, according to the first yesh omrim that the Ramah is about to bring down, Kol kesher she'enoi oser lahater ba'oser yoim atzmai, any knot that's intended to last for more than a day, any knot that you're not going to untie during the same day, it's going to last more than 24 hours. Mikri shal kayama b'miktsas, that's already a knot that's intended to remain in place for a significant amount of time. If it's intended to be in place for more than 24 hours, that's already a knot that's intended to remain in place for a considerable amount of time. V'asar lechatchila, and that's asim d'Rabbanan, according to Rashi and the Rosh. Uladei Shnia, and according to the second yesh omrim that the Ramah is about to bring down, Kol shamatira b'say shiva yomim, lo mikri shal kayama klal u'mutar lechatchila. So what the Mishnah Berurah is, now let's see the words of the Ramah, and then we'll just recap it outside. So says the Ramah, I'm going to read again from the beginning of the Haggah, 3 lines up from the bottom near the end of the line. Haggah, v'yesh cholkim. There are those, namely the Rashi and Rosh, that argue on the Rif and the Rambam, or they argue on the Shitas HaMechaber. Shitas HaMechaber, in order to be an Issa Daraisa, you need Kesher Shal Kayama and maaseh uman. But v'yesh cholkim, there are those who disagree. Shesvir lahu, they hold the chol Kesher Shal Kayama, any bona fide Kesher Shal Kayama that's darker liyas kach la'olam, afilu shal hedyet, even if it's not a maaseh uman, even if it's not a professional knot, it's a commoner's knot, chayavan alav, that's an Issa Daraisa. And now let's go further in the Ramah, v'yesh omrim, and there are those that say, shekol kesher she'enoi oser lahater ba'oser yoim atzmai, any knot that you're not intending to untie during the same day, so it's a knot that's intended to remain in place for more than 24 hours. Mikri shal kayama, that's considered a knot that's intended to remain in place for a significant amount of time, and that would be an Issa Darabanan. V'yesh mekilin, and there are those cheetahs that are more mekel, loimer da'at shiva yamim loy mikri shal kayama, that a knot is not considered even a knot that's lizman, even a knot that's intended to remain in place for a significant amount of time, only if it's going to be at least 7 days. But again, what we have to be clear about in this Ramah is that there's more than one argument over here between the Shitas HaRamah and the Shitas HaMechaber. Argument number 1, is that according to the Mechaber, to have an Issa Daraisa, you need Kesher Shakayama and Maisei Uman. According to the Ramah, which is Shitas Rashi in the Rush, in order to have an Issa Daraisa, you only need one. You only need that it should be a Kesher Shakayama. If it's a Kesher Shakayama, it's an Issa Daraisa. Then the question becomes, what if it's not a bona fide Kesher Shakayama? What if it's a knot that's intended to remain in place for a significant amount of time, but it's not darkly as kachla olam? Well, according to the Mechaber, even if it's intended to remain in place for a significant amount of time, but if it's not a kesher shakayama and it's not a ma'aseh uman, it's mutar lechatchila. According to the Ramah, no. According to the Ramah, if it's a kesher that's intended to remain in place for a significant amount of time, even if it's not a real kesher shakayama, and even if it's not a ma'aseh uman, it's an issa d'Rabbanan. Now the question is, what's considered a significant amount of time? And that's the two yesh oimrim over here in the bottom of Kuf Lamed Aleph Amud Aleph. Yesh oimrim shekol kesher she'eino aseh lahatir b'aseh yom atzmai mikri shel kayama. You have one shita that says once it's intended to remain in place for 24 hours, that's already considered a little bit kesher shakayama. The Ramah doesn't mean that it's a bona fide kesher shakayama. He means that it's a kesher shakayama that it's an issa d'Rabbanan. It's a kesher shakayama that it's intended to remain in place at least for a significant amount of time. It's doimek tzas lekesher shakayama, and therefore it's an issa d'Rabbanan. And that's the first yesh oimrim. And then the second yesh oimrim on the top of Kuf Lamed Aleph Amud Beis, the yesh mekilin loimer da'at shiva yomim loy mikri shakayama. And then you have the Mordechai, the more mekel shita, that holds that up to 7 days is not considered a kesher shakayama at all, and it's mutar lechatchila even according to the Ramah. But more than 7 days, even if it's not darkly as kachla olam, it's already an issa d'Rabbanan. Let's just take a look. Let's do Mishnah Berurah's cut and vav. Ba'isa yom atzmai. According to the first opinion, if you don't intend on untying the knot in the same day, it's already a kesher shayama k'tzas. It's already an issa d'Rabbanan. Says the Mishnah Berurah l'machar. This is a knot that you tied today, but you don't intend on untying it till tomorrow. Avalim osei lahater b'leil motzei Shabbos. But if you tie it on Shabbos and you're intending on untying it motzei Shabbos, loy mikri shel shakayama klal. That's not considered a kesher shakayama at all because it's less than 24 hours. U'mutar lechatchila, that would be mutar legamri. Umihu, in kosher b'leil Shabbos kodesh, if you tie something Friday night, va'aseh lahater b'yom Shabbos atzmai, and you intend on untying it tomorrow on Shabbos afternoon, afal gav de'ein mamish ba'isa yom, even though it's not technically the same day, become alkaim yesh limud d'shari, it would still be mutter. The chol pachas me'esrim rabba shaymai shais b'yom mikri, if it's less than 24 hours, it's called the same day. Okay, so we've got our entry into the world of the Isser of kosher, the Isser of tying knots on Shabbos, and we're going to see it brings with it the Isser of untying a knot. It's being matir, opening a knot. It's all going to go hand in hand. We have this very basic machlokes of what are the gedarim, what are the ground rules here. What's going to constitute an issa d'Oraisa? What's going to constitute an issa d'Rabbanan? And we'll pick up on this theme next time. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. This listen to limud HaTorah should be megan against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbeinu Shem should say, Yeshua's refuahs parnas and sheduchim tolos need. We should be zeicher to see the Bias Kol Tzedek b'meher v'yameinu amen. Be well.